say that we don't always do that in practice. Yeah. But the notion of an identity that makes us different actually doesn't necessarily come out of the way we actually behave, but how we like to perceive ourselves. So it's not like Australians like to see themselves as being egalitarian, but it's not necessarily how we've always behaved. But the key point here is that this frontier spirit in the 19th century, according to Ward, it created a tradition and it encouraged social values that emphasised egalitarianism and mateship. That great sort of Australian notion of mateship that almost every Prime Minister uses is seen to have first emerged in working on the harsh frontier. And this egalitarianism, according to some historians, helps distinguish Australian culture from its British roots. So Henry Reynolds, one of Australia's greatest sort of contemporary historians, has sort of provided a social psychological explanation for this bush myth, because he argues that unlike most nation states, up until the First World War, Australia really couldn't celebrate its foundation on any dramatic historical moment, such as war or revolution, that could capture the sense of Australian identity. Unlike Americans, the United States of America view their War of Independence and their Civil War as key episodes in which their identity was forged. But up until World War I in Gallipoli, Australia didn't have anything like that. Yes, as Richard has pointed out, there was a conquering of the original Aboriginal inhabitants of this land, but that was actually something that most colonists tried to erase from their minds. It was hardly something that was appropriate as a nation-building and identity-forming exercise. And so, as a consequence of this, before Gallipoli, according to Reynolds, the explorers provided the heroism supplied in other nations by military prowess and success in battle. Theirs was a battle fought and won over great natural difficulties and obstacles. Do you remember in my first lecture I was talking about this idea of the colonists being at war with nature? So it was this war with nature that almost gave Australians a sense of how they were able to forge their their identity. And so the importance of something like Gallipoli and Australia's participation in World War I on the popular imagination can be explained by the fact that many social commentators before World War I were concerned about the degenerative effects of the Australian climate and physical environment and the effect that that would have upon the Australian character. This is what's known as environmental determinism, the idea that if you put Europeans in a harsh, warm climate such as Australia, civilization would go backwards. And there was also a fear amongst certain Australians of the impact of what used to be known as the convict strain upon the descendants of the penal colony. So as Australia went into World War I, there was this argument as if you put white people in tropical climates, they'd become less civilized. This is what is called environmental determinism. So the great significance of Gallipoli and World War I was that the war was regarded as an ultimate test of national character, the national identity and character of this new nation. Were they up to the test of empire? And the Gallipoli experience was seen as a confirmation that the Australian character, the character of this new nation, was worthy of the British Empire. And so the egalitarian myth was extended to suggest that the Australian identity had been able to free itself from the more class-conscious British cultural moorings through claims that there was claims in World War I that Australian soldiers were less differential to others and that the social distance between Australian officers and their troops was less observable than you could find amongst, say, the British troops. And this was all put down to the fact that Australians, by working on the harsh frontier, had developed a more egalitarian character than other nations. So what's really happening here is that Russell Ward and others argue that the Australian character, or at least this Australian legend, this myth of egalitarianism, can be traced back to the way that the colonists shaped the bush with their axe and their plough and their shears and their guns. And so what Ward is trying to do here, along with other historians, is attempt to locate Australia's cultural origins in this idea of the transformation of the environment. And so the origins of this pioneer legend can be traced right back to the 19th century. And just think of some of Australia's great poems. Here's Mary Gilmore, who is on our sort of $10 sort of, our poet who's on the $10 note. Just listen to what she's saying here. This is all about the bushmyth. I bore the heat, I blazed the track, furrowed and bloody upon my back. I split the rock, I felled the tree, the nation was because of me. In other words, these are the origins of the Australian national identity and egalitarianism. And you get that as well with things like the work of the Heidelberg School, these artists of the late 19th century. You get this idea of these colonists working, it's a harsh frontier in which hard people, especially hard men, are being forged. And you find this also in McCubbin's famous triptych, The Pioneers. Look, if you actually look at it, it's probably one of the most iconic of all Australian paintings. It's all about the bushmyth, about the creation of this bushmyth. Here's the sort of the pioneers. You can see the woman in the front just dreaming of civilization back home, and here she is in the harsh bush. They don't even have a house yet. Here in the background is the sort of the husband with his sort of with his horse and carriage setting up a fire. Then you can see they've begun to build a home here. Again, notice how the fallen log and the axe. And again, the sort of the symbol. There's a little hut in the background with a little fire there, and they've begun to sort of create children, Australian children, in this harsh frontier. And then in the third one, this is all about this Australian bushmyth. You can see this is a generation or so further along, and you can see in the background where the pioneers have been, we've built a civilization. It looks actually a little bit like Burley Griffin there, doesn't it? But you can see in here is a sort of a young boy who has found this grave. It's almost as if they're saying, just like we do with sort of war stories, lest we forget the pioneers that built this great land. So you can see how so much of our art is built upon this bushmyth and the origins of the Australian character. And in fact, there's a lovely poem by the Canberra poet Geoffrey Page, who has written a poem called The Fourth Triptych, or the fourth panel that you can have in here. If you actually think about this story of the myth, what has been erased from this story of European colonizers taking over the land and forging this sort of new civilization? If you were to do a fourth panel, what do you think has been erased from this? The indigenous people, exactly. And that is precisely what Jeff Page's poem's about, called The Fourth Panel. It's all about how sort of indigenous Australians have been erased in this story here. But you've got this notion, okay, and this is why, as you know, look at Tom Roberts shearing the rams. You've got this masculine sort of notion of egalitarianism, people working hard on this harsh frontier, this collectivism. Australian sort of unionism was forged in the great shearer strikes of the 1890s. This is all about what makes Australia Australia. It's all about the harsh frontier, shearing the rams. Although I prefer Lunig's version, ramming the shears. But as the sociologist Belinda Probert says, in Australia, the shearer came in for adulation and mythologising, and the reason was because of this notion of people working on this harsh frontier. And we get it as well in the 1950s. We hear some Victoria's Premier, sort of Henry Gold,